Hello and welcome back to Tata Literature Live. For everyone who has just tuned in, we are proud to present the 11th annual Mumbai International Litfest, completely digital for the first time ever, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. There will be a 20-minute Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comments section of the platform that you are viewing from. Helen Keller has said, and I quote, "Walking with a friend in the dark is better than walking alone in the light." Well, I have 4,000 friends on Facebook, but I wonder how many will really show up if I need a friend. Social media has changed the way we make connections, but has the basic nature of human relationships changed? And can we continue to form bonds in the age of social distancing and lockdowns? We have with us today Robin Dunbar talking to us about how we make friends and why we need them. Robin Dunbar is a British anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist specializing in primate behavior. He is best known for the social brain hypothesis, the gossip theory of language evolution, and formulating Dunbar's number, a measurement of the cognitive limit to the number of individuals with whom any one person can maintain stable relationships. His publications include 15 authored or edited academic books and nearly 500 scientific journal articles. Vidita Vaidya is an Indian neuroscientist and professor at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. Part of her body of work includes the study of the neurocircuits that regulate emotion and how these mechanisms are influenced by life experiences. She is a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy and a senior editor of the European Journal of Neuroscience. A warm welcome to Robin Dunbar and Vidita Vaidya.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this session. I'm going to talk about for about 20 minutes about something which is very much part of our natural social life, as it were, and that is friendship. So I'm going to make really 4 points, really, I think. One is that friends really are very, very good for you. They're a good thing to have. But secondly, that there are limits on the number of friends that you can have. You can't have an infinite number of friends. And we'll say a little bit about the underpinnings that create friendships, as it were. And the point in some sense that I'll make is that friendships are born and not made, that actually you spend much of your time searching for people who gel well with you rather than gelling with them after you've become friends. And then the fourth point I'm going to make is simply that friendships are actually very fragile. They depend on a lot of effort on our part to keep the friendship well-oiled and working properly, if you like, and that if we don't invest time in our friendships, they will decay very, very rapidly. So, why are friendships good for you? Well, beyond all else, the one thing that they do most for you, it seems, is have a dramatic effect on your health and well-being. I think one of the things that's surprised everybody during the last 10, maybe 15 years is the absolute huge number of studies from medical epidemiology that have suggested that the single most important factor affecting your general psychological well-being, your physical health, how quickly you recover from surgery, even your chances of dying, is the number and quality of friendships that you have. There's one particularly nice study which I always like, in a way because it's very hard-nosed, but it collated over 140 of these epidemiological studies, essentially looking at what happened to people after they'd had their first heart attack and what best predicted their survival for the 12 months after that first heart attack. And way ahead of everything else was the number and quality of friendships that they had. Second only to that was actually giving up smoking, which was a little behind, but still in second place. And then way behind came all the other things that your doctor worries about in these circumstances. How healthy is your diet? How overweight are you? How much exercise do you take? What medicines are you on? What's the air quality in the place where you live? Of course, all these things have some effect, and they're not to be ignored. But by comparison with simply having a handful of good friends, they really are second place and matter much, much less. So friends are very good for you. I suspect it's partly because they bring you bowls of chicken soup when you're in bed and need some comfort. But also it turns out that the mechanisms that create friendships actually seem to tune the immune system, is the best way of describing it, and actually trigger the release of the white blood cells known as natural killer cells, which one of whose particular functions is to find and kill off viruses, which is, in the current situation we all find ourselves in, clearly a very good idea. So you might argue, well, if friends are very good for you, then the more friends we have, surely the better. We could go to Gillian's 4,000 friends on Facebook, and we would clearly be much more healthy than someone with only 10 or 20 friends on Facebook. The short answer is that would be very nice, but unfortunately our neurobiology imposes some severe constraints on the number of friends you can actually have. And by friends in this context, I mean friends that you have a real relationship with, a meaningful relationship that has history, essentially. So I've sometimes described this as, the sort of people who, if you saw them in the departure lounge at Hong Kong airport at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's nobody else about, you wouldn't feel embarrassed about going up to them and saying, good to see you, how are you doing? And so on, and catching up with them. They're people you know, that you have a personalized relationship with. And that's a very different concept, I hasten to add, to the concept of friends on Facebook. Friends on Facebook are, well, of course, some of those are indeed in that category, but most of them are in categories that we would really think of as acquaintances. So what limits the number of friends in this sense? The answer is, at root, the size of our brain, or particularly the part of the brain that is involved in handling social relationships. So this is not about just memory for people, but about how you manage the information about them and how you interact with them in a kind of coherent sort of way, as it were, and build a coherent relationship. And that mostly involves what's known as the default mode network in the brain, which involves bits up here in the frontal lobes, just behind your eyes, as it were, and above your eyes, but also bits here along the sides of the brain as well, in the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So it's quite a big bit of the brain that's actually involved in this. And it turns out that the number of friends you have actually correlates with the size of these brain regions across individuals in humans, and also it's now been shown in at least 2 species of monkeys. But more generally, this reflects a general relationship in monkeys and apes, that the bigger the size of the group they live in, the bigger the thinking part of their brain is, essentially the neocortex. So there's a limit imposed, if you like, by the size of your computer on how many friends you can manage. I kind of think of it really in terms of a juggler keeping balls in the air, and the more skilled you are at this, the bigger the computer you have to handle relationships, the less likely you are to drop one of the balls or say something which destroys a friendship instantly, and therefore limits the number of friends you can have. So it's partly about the size of the community. Of course, the software is important here, and the software is about understanding how other people think, what the implications of your actions, something you say, something you do, would have on the quality of your relationship with them, or indeed the quality of their relationship with some third party who you might also want to be friends with. If you offend your friend, then their friend is going to be upset about that too, and won't be your friend. So it's really about kind of maintaining this complicated spider's web of relationships between many individuals. And the limit in humans seems to be about 150 people, give or take a bit. It varies a little bit between about 100 and 250. Introverts tend to have fewer friends. Extroverts tend to have more friends. Younger people tend to have more friends. Older people tend to have fewer friends. I like to think of that as because we older people have become more selective about our friends and have just settled on the best ones to keep in time. Okay, so what makes the quality of a friendship in this sense? Well, part of it is about the time you invested. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But there is also an important component which is really about how much you share with an individual in a psychological sense. And these are what we call the 7 pillars of friendship. And the 7 pillars of friendship are really 7 cultural dimensions, which the more of these that we share with somebody, the stronger the emotional relationship will be. And indeed, the more willing we are to go and help that person out, the more willing we are to be altruistic towards that person. And these 7 pillars are sharing the same language, or better still, dialect, which is always, of course, very helpful because all the other pillars involve conversation. So if you can't speak to somebody at the beginning, you're not going to be able to find out what their other 6 pillars are about and decide whether or not they'd make a friend. But in addition to shared language, the other 6 are growing up in the same area. That's mainly because I think you have a common sense of community to which you belong, that you know how they think, and you know how much you can trust them, as it were, without having to find out in detail. So it's a kind of shortcut to that. It's having the same hobbies and interests. It doesn't really matter what those hobbies and interests are, but sharing the same hobbies and interests. Having the same worldview. The worldview is a sort of composite of religious views, moral views, political views. The next one is having the same educational trajectory, so going to the same university perhaps, or doing the same subject at university. So this is why, if you like, lawyers always make their best friends among other lawyers, and doctors always talk to doctors, and so on. And then the last 2 are shared musical tastes and shared sense of humor. And what's kind of interesting is when we looked at this in detail with how you would feel about meeting a stranger about whom you knew nothing at all, the single most important thing about them that made you think to yourself, this person might make a good friend, perhaps I'll spend more time with them, was shared musical taste. So there's something magical, if you like, about music, or musical taste, which flags up similarity and closeness psychologically that would make a good friendship. Now, all of these essentially are cultural. I mean, obviously, you can't do much about where you were born or grew up, and perhaps the language you live, but certainly all the other 5 are very, very much subject to change over the lifetime. And that's important because it allows us really to identify people who belong to our community, and keeps out interlopers, if you like, who might cheat on the system. So now the last component to this, which really is about the time you invest in friendships. And it turns out that time really is an extremely important dimension to this, because we look at our 150 friends, they're not all of the same quality. If you think about your friends, there are a few very dear friends that you like to cry on the shoulders of, and I can call those the shoulders to cry on friends, the ones who will come to support you under all circumstances. They will drop everything the moment your life falls apart. And then beyond them, there's a larger group, typically about 15. Your inner shoulders to cry on friends typically number about 5. And I should say that's usually half family and half friends in that group. So you'll have a couple of very close family members and then a couple of very close friends as your shoulders to cry on. Your emergency resource, as it were, to fall back on when you need picking up from when your life falls apart. Then outside that, there's a group of about, adds up to about 15. That includes the 5 in the center. And they are what we call your sympathy group. They're the people who you would feel very, very bad about if for example, they died tomorrow. They're the core to your social world, really. And then beyond that is another layer that comes in at about 50 individuals, and then finally 150 friends and family whom you regard as part of your natural social network. Now, it turns out that the amount of time we devote to these layers is directly proportional to the emotional sense we have in those relationships. So that inner core of 5 people, we actually devote about 40% of our total social time and social capital to. So each of them gets a huge amount of time. The next 10 people out that make up the rest of the sympathy group layer, the 15, get another 20%. So of your total social capital, if you like to think of it, and it doesn't matter whether you measure this in terms of emotional capital or time capital, your time to invest in social activities, those 15 people get 60% of your total social capital, your total social effort, which is extraordinary. The rest of them get very small quantities indeed. In fact, it works out at about, I think it's about 25 seconds per day or something like that. So you only need to see them once in a while to get up to a reasonable number. But the important thing here is that that investment of time really is correlated with our expectations of how much these individuals will help us out when we really need them. And the timings are very specific. They are, you need to see the people in that inner circle of 5 at least once a week. At least once a week, that's the minimum. The people in the 15 layer at least once a month. Otherwise, they will slide down into the layer below. So these relationships are extremely expensive in time. And with respect to friends, this doesn't really happen with family relationships, which are much more stable, if you like. But with friends, the extent to which our friendships continue in time is very dependent on how much time we invest in them. And if for some reason, of course, this is what's the problem, if you like, for us with lockdown, it's not so easy to get out and see our friends. This actually will start to have eventually destabilizing effects on the quality of those friendships. And on that rather glum note, perhaps, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Vidita, who's going to start the question sessions off with some questions she's thinking about. So, Vidita.
Hi, Robin. That was an interesting discussion and lots of food for thought already. I'm going to go with one of the ideas you mentioned, which is going through this list or a table almost, 5 soulmates, about 15 in your support group. Then you have this overnight camp or people you might go on a holiday with, which is about 50. And then the Dunbar limit. And I'd love to come back to that idea of how you nail down that number of 150. And then the next level, which is people you know through marriage, trade, etc. And then language, commonalities of language. I want to ask you, what goes further than that? What are the ideas that we create or we manufacture, in a sense, as a species, to generate kinship or notional sense of kinship with people whom we otherwise would not have any association with? So your comments on religion, political affiliation, the conceptual idea of nationhood itself as a common binding force to create a sense of kinship.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. You mentioned kinship, so let me start with that, because it seems to us that the 7 pillars of friendship, which seem to be so important in underpinning the quality of our friendships, the emotional quality of our friendship, and for recognizing people who might make good friends, so encouraging us to invest more time in them, to build a relationship with them. We think that those all point back really to essentially the community you grew up in, right? Not so much where you were born, but where you learnt how to be a member of a community, any community, where you were socialized, right? So, and that turns out to be exactly the same size as the natural community size in hunter-gatherer societies, which is their natural social unit. They don't necessarily live in the community because they live in these small camp groups, but those camp groups are always made up out of a community of about somewhere between 100 and 200 people, averaging again about 150, the Dunbar number as it's now known. Now we think that really kinship is just one of these kind of shortcuts to recognizing somebody who might be a good and reliable friend. So it's essentially what's lying at the root of this is trust in other individuals, that they're going to come and help you out, and they aren't going to cheat you on a bargain, kind of things like that. And it sort of allows us to get going quickly on interactions with strangers, if you like, in a context where it might have taken a whole year of intense interaction to find out really how good they are. It's like shortcuts to that. And kinship clearly is one of those in a sense, and it sits above the 7 pillars as kind of what the 7 pillars are trying to pick out. And of course, the advantage of kinship is, grandma and great-grandma tell us who is related to who and make sure we know. And of course, help us to keep track of what cousin Matilda is doing and all these kind of things. So kinship is a very densely structured network from those point of view. But the essence of this is really that in the end, then you can use the 7 pillars to build out, or what I should say is, it's a rather remarkable fact, anthropologically, at least to me, and nobody seems to have noticed it, is that no culture, I mean, there are 6 major kinship naming systems in the world, one of which is the Dravidian system from South Indians, one of the very widely distributed ones. And the others are like the Eskimo system, the Crow and the Omaha American Indian systems. And all cultures, all languages are one or other of these. I forget which English belongs to. I think it may be the Hawaiian system or something like that. But what that determines is the words you use for kin, right? How you describe kin, how you label them. And none of these 6 major kinship naming groups, so no culture in the world, has names for people that would naturally, in a naturally reproducing society, sit outside that community of 150. It's basically all the living descendants of your great-great-grandparents as a couple. That would produce on average about 150 people. So we don't seem to think it necessary to identify kin outside that limit. So when we live in bigger communities, as we came to do about 10,000 years ago, then we had to find mechanisms to kind of include people in that kinship system in effect. And the 7 pillars seem to do that very well. So shared musical tastes, as I said, is a particularly good one. Shared sense of humor works very well. But that can be quite esoteric because it depends on the language that you speak. Shared religions work very well. Shared moral views work very well as well. So we can effect this trick, if you like, of bridging out from these small hunter-gatherer communities to our much larger ones. But it's on a very fragile basis. They usually are what I call one-dimensional clubs. So we have a totem pole in the center of the village that we can all hang our hat on. And sometimes it doesn't matter what that totem pole is. It might be, you know, sort of that we're all enthusiasts for the game of tiddlywinks or the game of bridge. Any of these things will create a community. And I can meet you, you know, in Melbourne, Australia, as two complete strangers who happen to be sitting at opposite ends of the bar and in some pub there, and suddenly we both discover we're bridge aficionados, and now we're friends for life.
So, you know, I love that tiddlywinks analogy. Hopefully the tiddlywinks friends who discover each other miles apart don't have, you know, an upsurge of tribal desire to protect the tiddlywinks community. And yet, when you look at things like religion and nationhood, it's directly tied up with an aggressive desire to protect the conceptual idea that is the binding force or the totem pole that you talked about. Are there certain ideas that we use as a species to bind us that are prone to predispose us to actually have an aggressive desire to protect the tribe? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I think it's less that it's aggressive and more that it's defensive, because the thing we have to worry about, if you like, and the thing that all very social animals, so that's most of the monkeys and apes, essentially they live in implicit social contracts. Their societies are implicit social contracts, and they're stable. They're not like the societies of deer or of sheep or antelope, where they kind of form herds that quickly disperse when they've eaten all the food out of one particular area. The societies of monkeys and apes, and therefore us, as a member of that family, and a few other families like the horse family, the equids, so zebras, horses, donkeys, asses, the elephants, another very good example, of course, the dolphins as well, live in these stable communities, which, you know, you can be born into it and you die into it. Something very important for the survival of those groups, to prevent them breaking up, is trust in the other people and willingness to share, if you like, the other people. But the thing all these species have to worry about is essentially being cheated by people not playing their full weight in the collective responsibility, if you like. And so it's that trying to identify a cue of trust that another individual offers that becomes important. And that's why these seem to work, and why we come back to these small communities. And so whether we like it or not, it's kind of built on this in-group, out-group effect. And those in-group, out-group effects are very, very strong in humans, for better or for worse. You know, our problem is not to ignore them. It's how to kind of work around them for the better good, if you like. In this sense, we can be, I think, quite hopeful, because humans, if they, above all other species, have learned how to exploit the 7 pillars, and it's probably only because we have that 7 pillars as a cultural system, exploit that to create these much, much larger communities. The community of tiddlywinkers, as it were, that allows us to form these groups. But still, you know, and this is the root of the problem with religion, I'm absolutely clear, is that it works on the basis of an in-group, out-group process. And the problem we have to grapple with is how to kind of overcome that, really.
So, you know, coming to that idea of out-group and worldview, and one of the things in your 7 pillars is a shared worldview. What's the risk that your inner circle of friends becomes an echo chamber and prevents you from widening your worldview? Is it likely that someone who truly challenges the way you look at the world and might really actually be someone you would benefit from and learn immensely from is less likely to be in that group purely because they are actually challenging your worldview?
I'm sorry to have to say the answer is exactly that. It's very depressing, but it explains why echo chambers have, if you like, such power over us. And just in some sense, it goes back not so much to the fact that we want to have our ideas reinforced by our friends, as I think, in the end, the fact that it helps to smooth the flow of conversation. In the end, most of what we do in building networks and keeping our friendships going, ticking over nicely over time, is based on conversation, because, you know, that is one of our key characteristics as a species. And, you know, if you have somebody who's constantly arguing with you and telling you you're wrong, this does not make for a good conversation. And more still, it's very difficult to tell jokes when somebody is shouting at you. And laughter, you know, is one of those oils that smooth the flow of natural social engagement. So if we laugh with people, we feel happier. And of course, the singing does exactly the same. You know, so singing with them makes us feel happier too. It makes us feel that we've always known this person forever, you know, and therefore they're a good person. But that's extremely difficult to do if your best friend is always telling you, no, this is wrong. So you tend to kind of steer away from them and find people who are easier to talk to. And that's the root, I think, psychologically, of the echo chamber phenomenon. But it is not a good thing. There is no question about it. And I think everybody recognizes that, not least business, because, you know, one of the things business has learned is it's very important to have, and of course in science it's the same, you know, it's very important to have new ideas coming into the system, and new ideas usually come from somebody who's never been part of the lab or part of that group business before, coming in with completely new ideas. And you'll probably know as well as I do that most of the great discoveries in science have come about because somebody from another discipline has kind of looked over the parapet of the trench lines and gone, oh, that looks interesting, let me come and help you. And if you let them in, then, you know, all is nirvana and sweetness and light, because suddenly new things are discovered that you would never have thought about. So, you know, our task always is how to overcome those echo chamber effects. Echo chamber effects are very, very good in the social environment, right? It makes for friendly conversations and a lot of fun and good parties. But it's probably not such a good idea in business, in the lab, in science, administration, etc., etc.
You know, coming back to this idea of these silos that we create, I'm curious, as an evolutionary biologist who looks at social interactions, which are also the domain of sociologists and other anthropologists and those who study culture and come from a different stream, in a sense, and a discipline. How easy is it to sort of get conversations going across the parapet in that sense, and how do people react to the idea that our brain might explain the number of friends that we have or the limit on the number of friends that we have?
The answer is usually I think they walk away and hope I'll disappear, because this looks terribly like genetic determinism or something dreadful of that kind. The answer, of course, is it's not, because a lot of it is actually cultural. The 7 pillars are cultural. So I kind of sometimes like to describe the situation more like, think of a game, any game, football, hockey, cricket, whatever you like. You know? There are some rules that establish the basis of the game and say how the pitch should be laid out, you know, where you put the white lines on the pitch, and where the goal is, or whatever the objective is, you know, where you put the stumps in cricket and all these kind of things. But how you actually play the game is only constrained by the shape of the pitch and those rules. It's not determined by those rules. You know, how you actually play the game depends on strategy of the moment. You know, spotting a hole in a weakness in the defense that you can get through, or you know, if you're bowled a very bad ball by the bowler, that you can take a big hit at it and get a 6 over the boundary. All these kind of things that make for the excitement of the game. So this is you know, yes, there are genetic components, but the whole thing isn't. Everything we do isn't genetically determined. Exactly the same as, you know, any physical aspect of our body is a composite of both genetic influences and environmental influences. Well, there are some exceptions. The color of your eyes and the color of your hair are very tightly genetically controlled, but those are very exceptional, really. And most of the other things, like, for example, stature, only 20% of the variation in stature is due to genetics. The rest of it is due to, you know, what your mother fed you. And how many, dare I say it, you know, how many McDonald's beef burgers you ate as a teenager. You know, it's your experiences of life and are just as important in this context.
Well, this is what we study in the lab, which is how experience shapes the circuits that regulate emotion. And there's a profound influence of experience, no question. I'm wondering, where do we acquire the ability to be a good friend? Is that also something that we learn very early on? And is this culturally transmitted by what we see around us as youngsters? How are we learning those tenets or principles of how to be a good friend? And how to attract good friends too?
You're asking the questions about the secrets of life now. The short answer is, I think, in the end, it lies in two key cognitive or psychological capacities, which are very, very important in all primate and human social groups. They're what allows us to keep these groups together rather than driving the group apart by behaving badly towards everybody. And those two key capacities are, one of them is known as mentalizing or mind reading. It's the ability to understand what somebody else is thinking and to understand how what you do will affect how they see your behavior or see you, how they will interpret what you do. And also, in addition to that, this is where it starts to get complicated now, how what you do to your friend is seen by your friend's friend, or maybe by your friend's mother, who may have come charging out into the playground to deal with you. So those capacities to understand how other people see, and particularly how the network of people see a particular action of yours, or particularly, are very, very costly in cognitive terms. I mean, they are highly demanding in terms of neural processing in the brain. And indeed, our capacity to do that, which is partly what explains our very large groups, is about 3 times greater than any other animal can do. The apes come close to us, the orangutans, the gorillas and the chimpanzees, the great apes come closest to us, but they're about 1/3 as good, as it were. They really cope with dyads very well, how somebody else is thinking, but they can't cope about how a friend of a friend is thinking about you. So that's one component to it. It's very much locked into the size of your mentalizing circuit, or the default mode neural circuit in the brain. It's just an information processing thing of it, essentially. The other is inhibition. It's the ability to inhibit what psychologists call prepotent actions. So it's your ability to inhibit grabbing the biggest piece of cake on the plate in order to allow other people to have a share. So this goes back to my point about primate social systems are implicit social contracts. We have to be prepared to give up something to allow everybody to have a fair share of the system. Otherwise, they're going to get fed up and leave and find somewhere where they can get more. Now that too depends on some hard wiring in the brain. The size of, in particular, the frontal pole here, just behind your forehead, and that's true across primates and into humans. So those two together are, if you like, hardwired in your ability, but they come from a lot of experience. That's why we have such a long childhood, because we aren't born with that. If you like, we're born with an empty computer, and we have to put the software into it. And that software comes during socialization. And mentalizing and inhibition in particular are two things that we kind of scaffold through experience. So if you're brought up in isolation, you don't develop those skills well enough to have close friendships and to keep bigger groups together. If you're brought up in a wide group of other people, a family and a community, you learn these skills. And the key to it is really learning the skills of diplomacy. That's what it's all about.
Thanks, Robin. We're going to open it up now to questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty. And we'll pull the audience in with audience questions now. All right, here's one. It's a doozy. It's always a common one that we hear often, which is, do you think people of the opposite sex can be genuine close friends, just friends?
This is the other $64 million question, yes. The answer is yes and no. One of the interesting things about our social networks, our networks of friends and family, is they're highly, highly gendered. And this actually starts from the age of 2. And the figures don't change at all, right the way across the lifespan. But about 70% of men's extended social networks of 150-ish people are male, and about 70% of women's social networks are female. And the other 30% who are of the opposite sex are basically your extended family and in-laws, whom you have no choice about anyway. And that probably goes back to lots of kind of psychological components about how easy it is for the two sexes to talk together. It's probably, the conversational styles are very different between the sexes, which actually then makes it kind of more difficult to hold a conversation across the sexes. But that said, what's interesting about close friendships is that women in particular will have both a romantic partner and a kind of best friend, sometimes known as a best friend forever or a BFF. Only around 85% of those best friends will be female. About 50% actually will be male. And kind of roughly the same proportion in men. The trouble is, men don't really... Best friends forever is a foreign concept to men. They have a much more casual view of relationships, and so they don't have this intensity that women have. So the answer is it's possible, but there is always a risk of a sex sitting behind the relationship, particularly coming from the men's side, it seems. I mean, there's work in social psychology, not anything we've done, but women will see a best friend who's male as a best friend, whereas men will see a best friend who's female as a potential romantic partner, not as a best friend as such. So that creates a tension. Doesn't mean to say it doesn't work, it can't work. It's just that it adds, kind of one layer of difficulty which you have to be aware of and manage, if you like.
It also speaks to how socialized our genders or sexes are in terms of what's expected of them, in a sense as well, which plays in as a big component in terms of how valued friendships are and how much people expect to derive from those friendships. Women support sort of the sisterhood effect, the
Yes.
the soul sisters that you speak about who have your back. And, the idea that they're an essential component of your life is something that's reinforced over and over again with a lot of women, but may not being reinforced. It's interesting to think about the cost of that on men's health in terms of the lack of a support network that really then doesn't come into play for them in the same way.
This is absolutely true. I'm not sure how much of it really is socialized, to be honest. If you look at boys' friendships and girls' friendships very early on in life, they have these same patterns as they do in adults, really. I kind of always describe this in terms of how life was when you were about 8 or 9. Right now, for a girl, girls have these very often one-on-one, very intense friendships. And if Susan doesn't invite you to her party, you know, this is the crisis of the universe. It's the end of the world as we know it. For boys, friendship is kicking a football backwards and forwards across the roadway. Now, I maintain that it doesn't really matter for a boy whether it's a little boy that kicks the football back or a wall. As long as the football comes back, that's a friendship. And so boys' friendships from a very early age have this kind of, who cares, you know, here today, gone tomorrow. There's, you know, if you disappear because your family moves away, I just find somebody else to play with. It's not a crisis. And that, I don't think that changes very much in the next 70 years.
So there's 2 questions which I can sort of tie up together. One is, how effectively can we use social media to stay in touch with friends, especially given the current isolation that we're all in? And the second question is, how important is spontaneity in building friendships?
Okay, so the first one is obviously very relevant to the current moment. We've had a look at this. I mean, so have a lot of people really, ever since Facebook and in particular the social networking sites came online, because people obviously use it so much to keep their friendships up, which was what Facebook was originally designed for. It was, you know, designed for when a group of college kids left college and dispersed over the whole of the United States and would never be able to meet up again so easily. So it was the way they could continue their friendships. And it's clearly, you know, that is how we use it, and that is how it does a very good job in those senses. Our research on this, and indeed other people, suggests that in the end, all these social media, it really includes the telephone even, and, you know, I mean, phoning people as well as texting people, all these digital media are no more really than a sticking plaster. What they do is slow down the inevitable rate of decay on a relationship over a longer period. But there's nothing on earth that's going to stop that friendship if you can't meet up because you're now living in 2 cities on the other side of the country. Nothing on earth is going to stop that friendship eventually just becoming an acquaintanceship, you know, which is one of those people in the next layer out. And many of the people you work with will be in the acquaintances layer outside the 150. You know, but also a lot of the people you knew in the past go into that box, if you like. And gradually you lose touch with them, really, in terms of the 7 pillars, because, of course, you have different experiences, you meet different kinds of people, they give you different musical experiences that you suddenly realize are very exciting. You discover different stand-up comics or whatever it is, and read different books that cause your 7 pillars to drift apart. Now, it seems to us from everything we've done that nothing on earth will stop those friendships decaying if you don't meet up sometime, right? So there's nothing like seeing the whites of somebody's eyes, being able to stare into their eyes and
Did we lose Robin?
I think we are facing a little bit of trouble. We'll very quickly go into a troubleshooting site. Give us a second, please.
Okay.
This is, the reach is too far. But what I was saying is that in the end, there's something about being able to, stare into the eyes of somebody across the table to see the immediacy of their responses to you, but also being able to put an arm around their shoulder, stroke their hand or whatever, because we actually use physical touch much more than we imagine. So my challenge to the techies in Silicon Valley, wondering what to do for the next phase of, and in Bangalore, here's a challenge for the Bangalore guys, what to do for the next phase of digital media. It's solve the problem of virtual touch, because I reckon if they can solve the problem of virtual touch, they will probably get and deserve the next Nobel Peace Prize.
Here's a question that's coming from Shrisha Bhatt. She says, how do introverts maintain friendships? It always seems to take an extra effort to do that when there's a sincere and genuine interest in the friendship. How do you sustain friendships more organically, especially when you're an introvert?
Okay, so I think this really just comes down to the difference between introverts and extroverts. And we've done quite a lot of work on this because it's been quite interesting from our point of view. And this seems to be simply a different style, essentially, although there may be neurobiological roots to whether you're an introvert or an extrovert on that dimension, as it were, where you lie on that dimension. The difference really seems to be whether you are risk averse in your relationships or risk averse. So introverts essentially take the strategy of being wanting to have you really close, well gelled relationships.
Everybody heard me on the main.
Extroverts prefer to have many friends and take the risk that most of those friendships will be less intense. And that's very characteristic of the two. The introverts have much more, they devote more time to each of their friends, so their friendships are much stronger and more strongly emotionally close, and therefore more reliable. Whereas extroverts have to spread there, because we have the same amount of, we have the same time essentially and the same emotional capacity. They spread that capital more thinly across many people, which means they have more people they can call on, but each of those are going to be less reliable because they're spending less time with them. So it's a kind of lifestyle choice, if you like, although that's probably not made for us. That goes deeply back into perhaps our socialization and our neurobiology, if you like. But that's all the difference is. So neither one is better than the other. They're just two different ways of achieving the same end. What is interesting is, from some of our modeling analyses, is that if you have a mix of introverts and extroverts in a social network, the social network works much better in terms of information flow around it. And that's partly because the extroverts, of course, acting like social butterflies, keep everybody informed as to what's going on. I prefer the introvert end myself.
Here's a question coming to you from Manasi Karandikar. She said, can someone be friendship challenged in that they just view friendships or individuals as a means to an end? And what are deal breakers in a friendship?
Well, I guess the answer is, the richness of the variety of human psychological types is such that there will always be some people who, at the kind of extreme, some people who are very intensely social and some people who are more, if you like, exploitative of their friends, perhaps. That's in the nature of all things biological. They have diversity built into them. I suppose part of the problem, actually, that we're trying to cope with is that we're trying to avoid being exploited too much by other people among whom we live. And that's what friendships are our guard against, partly. They're our protection against being exploited by free riders, as the technical term is, or as I sometimes say, the second-hand car salesman who wants to sell you very bad old car for a lot of money, but you don't know any better. And we have, society or social life only exists, or can only exist, if that doesn't happen too often. We can tolerate a few freeloaders, as it were, on the system, but if there are too many of them, then it breaks down the fabric of society, because everybody retreats into their silos for self-protection. So, yes, they're there. You have to learn to cope with them. I'm not sure what a deal breaker is in a friendship in that sense. If it isn't a best friend forever, it's the one that really makes the difference to your serenity and peace of mind and general well-being, because of the support they provide you.
I want to build on that question. You started off by saying that friends are essential for in fact, one of the biggest impacts they have is on our health, which is how well we will live, how long we will live, the quality of our life, all of that. How about the reverse, which is having a friend, losing friends, fragmenting relationships? Because across the world over right now, given the strains that this particular set of isolation has put on everyone, people are failing to sustain the very friendships that matter to them. And so you see fragmenting relationships everywhere. What is the cost of that on well-being?
So far, I suspect fairly minor. The only people who I think will show, or perhaps show an effect already so far, are going to be old people, because what happens in old age, from about the age of 60 onwards, is that you gradually shed friendships. Not that you do this deliberately, but your friends die, the same-aged family members die, and eventually you end up much more socially isolated, with a much smaller social circle than you did in the teenage years or your prime of life even. And that decline is inexorable, because when that happens to you as a teenager or in your 20s or 30s, if somebody moves away to another country or something, you just kind of fill their slot with somebody else, because you go to the places where you met friends before, at clubs, parties, cinemas, whatever, But for old people, it looks a bit strange if you turn up as a grey-haired 70-year-old like me at a young person's party, and B, you kind of don't have the energy to do it anymore, So, and this is what causes their social networks to shrink. So I think they're already on that downhill slope, and this will just exacerbate that and make it worse. So they're the ones that really are going to have the biggest problem, because I think the younger people will just bounce back out of it and kind of do what they always did, and go back to clubs and parties and cinemas and so on, where they naturally make their friends. And of course, I perhaps only need to remind you of what happened after the last big pandemic, which was the Spanish flu. What happened immediately afterwards? It was the Roaring '20s. People had a big party time as they rushed about, kind of in joy, if you like, after the end of the pandemic. So it will kind of have, aside from that, I think that's the biggest risk we run. Aside from that, I think for you as an individual and your personal friends, it will kind of weaken them a little bit, but so you'll kind of have to repair them. Now, we see that happening anyway. So when we've looked at big national telephone databases, for example, looking at who's calling who and for how long, what we find is if somebody hasn't called someone they call regularly for a bit, perhaps they've been away on holiday, on a yacht around the world, or whatever people do for their holidays, when they next call them, that next call is much longer. It's almost twice as long, as though they're kind of repairing the relationship and trying to restore it. So I think you'll find that people will kind of try to meet up again with the friends that are important to them, to try and rebuild those relationships, or at least prevent them decaying any further. But this does only apply to friendships. It doesn't apply to family relationships. Family relationships are extremely robust in this context, and family are all forgiving. You know, well, I won't say all forgiving, because there comes a point when even family have had enough with your bad behavior. They say, that's it. But all else equal, you know, they're very forgiving if you're not contacting them and you know, abusing them maybe, and they will still welcome you into their house in a way that friends kind of won't. And of course also, you know, the point about family relationships is they're this very, very strong network where somebody is always keeping track of what's going on and will let people know, you know, how the network is changing, keep you up to date with what's going on. So you're in a much better position. But that makes family relationships robust. And so those won't kind of change, I don't think. Although it's interesting here, I don't know if this is also happening in India, but a lot of people have been having kind of virtual meals or virtual perhaps pub quizzes with people, and a lot of those have been with family rather than with friends. There seems to be this sort of family kinship premium again kicking in, going, no, family is important. I've got to keep those relationships, preserve those relationships if necessary. But, you know, friendships change all the time. You know, there is a constant turnover of friendships. They don't last forever, most of them. There are a few that do, but most of them are friendships of convenience of the moment, if you like. And so there's a constant turnover as you meet new people, or perhaps somebody moves away. So this is kind of nothing new, because all that will happen is you will replace them with somebody you've met perhaps in the street whom you've not had a chance to meet before, but now, because you can't go out, you see them more often and perhaps get to know them and think, oh, you know, they would actually be fun to be friends with. So you make the effort to invest in them. So you perhaps replace distant friends with closer friends. That may be one of the, who knows, one of the benefits. It may help make the local community more of a community.
Thanks, Robin. Lots of things to think about, and you know, eventually friends are the family that you choose. They're the ones that you sort of make and create, and personally I would say that they're just absolutely critical for one's survival and joy in life. So you know, I think when one is very lucky and blessed when one has good friends, and one is honored if one has a chance to be a good friend to someone as well. It's one of the greatest pleasures in a sense of life. Thoroughly enjoyed our discussion, and I guess we're coming to closure right now, and I'll hand back to Gillian.
Thank you, Robin Dunbar and Vidita Vaidya. This has really reminded me of this song, I Get By With a Little Help From My Friends. This has been a wonderfully engaging and relevant conversation. Thank you so much. Safe to say my Facebook friend list really needs some reassessment. Thank you to our title sponsor, Tata, and to you, our audience, for being here today and sending in all your wonderful questions. Coming up at 5:15 p.m. IST is the book launch of Ramchandra Guha's The Commonwealth of Cricket, following which he will be in conversation with Rajdeep Sardesai about the country's obsession with, well, cricket. Stay logged in.